Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in for our midweek show, and it should be a good one. As always, kicking things off with our midweek NBA power rankings back after the All-Star break. We're continuing talking about the MLB a little bit, a couple of hot stove rumors heading into spring training now that it's fully getting into swing, and also doing our MLB power rankings as well. And then we mix in some football from both sides of the pond, starting off with a segment about how certain teams through the draft can build like the Philadelphia Eagles, and looking at how certain players in this year's draft fit certain prototypes of Philadelphia Eagles players. So I thought that would be really cool. And then concluding with a big top 6 semi-clash here, because both teams kind of are on the peripheries of the top 6, with Villa going up against Chelsea. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you haven't done so already. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Always a great way to get involved with the show, whether it be through leaving any comments, questions, concerns you have through the show, or tips and donations. Anything you do is generally appreciated. You can also do it through our website, gsmcsportsnetwork.net, and it makes our shows, for that matter, that much better when we are contributing to them. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the first segment of today's show. Gonna be our midweek NBA power rankings. Now that we're back from the All-Star break, we are going to be looking at the top 5 teams headed into the stretch run, the true contenders to compete for the Larry O'Brien Trophy, in my humble opinion. And as it goes along, this list could be ever changing, but I feel like we now know what our top 5 is going to look like going forward. And so without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with our number 5 team here, the New York Knicks. Now, the New York Knicks are an interesting team because we all know the Tom Thibodeau formula. In fact, this starting 5 has played 278 more minutes than any other lineup in the league this season, and Brunson is the facilitator of all things concerning that starting 5, for that matter. He's in the top half of the league in terms of time of possession, actually leads the league in terms of time of possession, averaging 8 minutes per game with the ball in his hands, and in clutch usage rate. And him and Jokic are the only 2 players in the NBA right now to be shooting over 50% in the clutch moments. So ultimately, when you have a starting 5 that is reliable and a player who can finish games for you as well as Brunson has, including that last-minute overtime winner against the Atlanta Hawks a couple weeks ago, I feel like anything is possible for this New York Knicks team. However, the one important stat to note here is that they're 0-5 against the top 3 teams in the league, and I feel like that has a lot to do with the Tom Thibodeau formula as well. There are a lot of positive to take away from the Tom Thibodeau formula, and that you feel like you have a starting 5 strong enough to contend with anyone in the league. But if you want to contend for a championship, you got to find some variety to mix it up. And coming out of the All-Star break, to make matters worse, they play, I believe, 2 of the top 3 teams in the league, and 11 of 14 of their next games on the road. So it's going to be a tough road to hoe for the New York Knicks coming up in the weeks ahead, because of the fact that, like I said, the Tom Thibodeau formula can work, but will it work against the top teams when it matters? So that's why the Knicks are still in my top 5, but not quite in the top 3 just yet. And in terms of a team that could steadily drop out of the top 5 altogether, how about the Memphis Grizzlies? This is a team that's lost 2 of its last 3, but I do like a lot of things about it. And I feel like this team wants to set the tempo. They want to get out in transition, utilize both Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr.'s abilities. In fact, they average 34.2 transition points per game, and they are amongst the top 7 most fast-paced teams in the league. But I do feel that they are a team that, to me, is too Morant and Jackson centric, and I feel like that could come back to bite them in certain moments. And this Memphis team, not to say that they're slowly declining in the rankings of the Western Conference, but I feel like now they can't make up enough ground to where they can keep this thing close with OKC at the top of the Western Conference. They're still on the periphery, I think, of being a solid team come postseason time, but I don't believe that this team is gonna be good enough in the postseason if certain players in this roster don't step up. So that's why Memphis is kind of hanging on precariously in these rankings as of this moment. They have a chance to get back into the swing of things. They do play their first 3 games after the All-Star break against the top 7 East teams, and anything can happen there. They're not necessarily that good against the upper cream of the crop in the Eastern Conference. So that's what I worry about for Memphis going ahead. But they still find themselves in the thick of the Western Conference standings upper half, and anything can happen down the stretch for them. They just need to play within themselves. Then at number 3, a team that quickly ascend up the rankings to maybe as high as number 1 here, the Boston Celtics have won 8 of their last 9. 3 games left against the Knicks, a team that they have had their number against. They're the only team, actually, that first stat was not wrong, and we'll get to why in a matter of minutes. But they are the only team in the league that ranks in the top 5 on both ends of the floor, and also in every aspect of offense. They can score in the paint, they can score in the mid-range, and they can score from the three-point line. This Celtics team is not, Joe's 3-ball, live and die philosophy anymore. This is a very variable team, and what I mean by that is they have the players on the interior, they have the players on the perimeter to really threaten you, and that's why they're finally getting into the swing of things, really becoming the team we expected them to be this season. And they're actually underperforming in terms of win expectation, and that just goes to show that this team can even amp it up ever more. And they have one of the easiest schedules left in the NBA. So that's why Boston can certainly find itself in the coming weeks atop these power rankings. And especially when you consider the fact that the East is definitely not necessarily the deeper conference. So if they can continue to win the game they need to and prove that their wins against the Cavaliers and the Knicks before the All-Star break weren't flukes, then this Boston team certainly has merit to it and can certainly be one of the teams to challenge OKC at the top. But I still have Cleveland above them just in terms of record and because they're also in good form. They won 7 of their last 8, and I feel like they are such an elite team because they have this tempo about them where they don't necessarily speed things up too much, but they also have that within them. They can find the matchups they like and exploit you from there because only 21.5% of their points come from the fast break and in transition. That's really impressive for a top team. And what I really like about this Cavs team as well is because they really found a nice perimeter threat in Darius Garland, but Evan Mobley gives them an opportunity to stretch the floor as well. And because him and Donovan Mitchell are so fascinating driving to the rim, that's what allows the perimeter threat to be even more potent. And don't forget that Darius Garland is such an elite passer as well. So all those different things combine to make the Cleveland Cavaliers a dangerous team at the top of the East. They have 3 games left against the Knicks, and those 3 games could potentially be the difference in how they're viewed headed into the postseason, because if they win all 3, go 2-1, then they have a chance to be viewed as a team that could meet Boston and challenge them in the Eastern Conference Finals and beyond in the NBA Championship for whoever represents the West. But for now, this Cleveland Cavaliers team needs to take care of business and focus on making sure that when those 3 games against the Knicks come, they don't crack under pressure. But everyone right now is still looking up at the OKC Thunder at the top of the rankings. They're actually coming off a loss. Their only second double-digit loss of the season to the Minnesota Timberwolves. And I feel like I don't necessarily view that as something to worry about if you're an OKC Thunder fan. And I feel like this Thunder team really has grown into a tough team where, because they haven't really lost many games badly, you're going to get their best shot when you face them again. They never lose to the same team twice. They never go on these epic losing streaks where you find concern for them. In fact, they're 12-7 in games they've trailed by double digits. But the one concern, if I am an OKC Thunder fan, is that 5 of their first 6 games post All-Star break are on the road. So OKC is going to have to become road warriors down the stretch and prove that they can continue to keep this pace of winning games and not necessarily find themselves in a rut to maintain their number 1 status. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because this rankings could be ever changing in the coming months, but I feel like the top 5 has become a little bit more solidified over the past several weeks. But coming up next, we'll be transitioning to the world of MLB yet again, talking about some hot stove rumors that could concern certain teams and certain position groups as spring training gets fully underway. We'll be right back to talk about it after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network for our second segment of today's show. Before we get into it, as a matter of fact, I do want to remind you as always to tune in and consider availing yourselves of the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net, to better contribute and interact with our shows. It's always genuinely appreciated whatever you do for our shows around the network, and it just makes them that much better when you decide to contribute to them. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of today's show, another MLB segment. We're going to be talking a lot more training is in full swing. But I do want to kind of talk about where things stand in terms of the hot stove rumors that could still be rumbling on the league. I know a lot of the big ones have already been determined, with Bregman going to the Red Sox, Alonso re-signing, and things of that nature. But there are still, loose ends to tie up potentially around the league. Maybe we'll extend into next season or the trade deadline perhaps. But still some questions to be asked of certain teams, of certain position groups, of certain players, and how they fit into the market that's ever changing. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with potentially one of the final loose ends to tie up in this particular free agency cycle. Maybe there are going to be a couple more players moving around, but Nolan Arenado certainly becomes the center of attention. I know that Vlad Guerrero Jr. has decided not to extend thus far with the Toronto Blue Jays, but Nolan Arenado is also someone who shockingly remains with St. Louis. And I feel like this one is a little bit more pressing just because that Vlad Guerrero Jr. situation seemingly is one in which Vlad Guerrero Jr. holds court, and this situation is where the Cardinals are in a position where they can offload a lot of young talent, but also a guy like Arenado as they bring in more farm system players. And I think that the Cardinals not moving on Arenado as of yet could be an intriguing factor to look into either at the next trade deadline or next year's free agency cycle. Because right now, the market for Arenado is not there anymore. Because Bregman has gone to a team that was really looking to acquire him in the Red Sox. And a lot of teams are tying up loose ends for the players that you could have made a deal for if you're the Cardinals. So it looks like they're going to go into this season with Arenado, which isn't necessarily a huge plus, but it's not necessarily sweat off my back if I'm the St. Louis Cardinals, because you go again next cycle and see what the market's like then. But you don't necessarily have the same market for him as you would have had this been addressed sooner, because everyone else has moved around. So that's where this situation stands as of now for Nolan Arenado. But the one thing that I am concerned about, if I'm St. Louis, before we go on to the next subject, is the fact that you're going to have to eat a lot of money later on because of retaining him. So by being stubborn, it does hurt you financially, and who knows, maybe he earns enough to warrant extending his contract, but if you are going to have to let him go in the future, you're going to have to deal with a dead money hit. So that's a big concern for the Cardinals, potentially in the future. But now let's get into the pitching market, because right now I feel like it's not necessarily the deepest pitching market there could potentially be, but there still are questions to be asked of who might still be out there and could give you good service this season, or potentially next season as well. And I feel like, Clayton Kershaw is going to be someone who, if he doesn't necessarily perform for the Dodgers after all the injury concerns surrounding him, he could exit. Andrew Heaney, I was wrong yesterday in saying that he was still with the Rangers. I thought he had re-signed, but he is still on the market, and he's preparing himself in his own little pitching lab. Guys like Kenley Jansen and David Robertson are competent closers if you're looking for that relief and bullpen help. And if you're looking at this free agent market, you have to think that you're going to get someone who's not a high on talent, a number one starter, but a guy who can get you good innings. It's a bulk kind of pitching market, not necessarily one where you're going to get the high-end star. Guys like Quintana and Kyle Gibson are reaching the threshold where they can pitch or just about 165 to 170 innings for you. But if you want someone who's a little bit more varied in their pitching approach, guys who have a little bit more pitching in their arsenal, guys like Turnbull and Eunice have well above average pitches where they can attack you from different angles and come at you with different stuff and more varied than, say, just innings eaters. And then there are also veteran guys who can be competent enough starters for you as well, the Striplings, Yarboroughs, and Flexons of the world. And then guys as well coming back potentially from injury that could give you good upside to your pitching staff, like John Means or Dave Sclafani. And then in the bullpen, there's a lot of bulk here as well. A lot of interesting guys, potentially from your middle relievers to your closers. Kyle Finnegan's still out there. He has an impressive amount of saves over the past 4 seasons. Lefty relievers looking to be an interesting market this offseason, specifically Chafin, Colin Poche, Brooks Raley, Drew Smiley, Jalen Beeks could all be available. A righty reliever, Kimbrel's out there, Kelly's out there. These are all fascinating guys. Lance Lynn could be out there, as he's someone who could project to go to the bullpen after an illustrious career in the league as a starter. But ultimately, if you're a team that's looking to contend or is on the periphery of contending, you have to recognize the necessity of depth. And that's what this pitching market holds. You're not going to get someone, if you're a contending team, who's necessarily going to launch your pitching rotation to the stratosphere. No, it's all about shoring up the cracks. Because I'm going to be talking about my power rankings, and there are certainly a lot of rotations that might not need a fix within those power rankings. But they might be looking, these top 5 teams I'm going to talk about later, for depth in their pitching staff. Maybe even in their bullpen as they get down the stretch. But right now, you could do no worse than potentially picking up a guy like Kershaw, Heaney, Jansen, or Robertson if you're looking for that relief help. But I do feel like it's going to be tricky for a lot of these teams to potentially sign these veteran guys and keep them there and retain them. Maybe that's not what teams are in the market for, but I feel like you have to invest fully into one of these pitchers if you want to retain them for a long time and actually think of them as something beyond just depth in your lineup. It's going to be interesting to see how this market pans out, not just this year, potentially at the deadline, but in next year's free agency cycle in the offseason, where a lot of these guys are going to be hot commodities, potentially for teams on the brink of contention. So that's why I wanted to bring up the pitching market, because it's very interesting. Then let's get into the hitters here. And I feel like the hitting market has slowly decreased a little bit just because of the fact that there are a lot of aging guys on the free agent market for the upcoming deadline and next season as well. And you're not necessarily going to see much movement now as opposed to potentially in 2026. I feel like this year, every sort of business that could be done for a power bat has been done already. And I know we're going to continue to talk about Arenado and Vlad Guerrero Jr. as the season goes on, but now you're going to have to start looking at guys in the 26 cycle. Guys like JD Martinez. He's going to be a free agent, actually a free agent this year. He's 37 years old, and he's an above-average hitter, but I don't necessarily think he has a spot with the Mets. I don't know why I said the Knicks there. With the Mets in the long-term future, so teams could look to add him as a depth piece, maybe as an interesting power bat for teams kind of in the midst of contention. And then someone like Alex Verdugo. He's someone who's more of a rotational piece, both offensively and defensively, but he could be an interesting kind of situation for a very specific kind of team where they're just looking to add as many depth pieces to their roster down the stretch. And then Jose Iglesias as well. Not just Martinez for the Mets, but Jose Iglesias. How could we forget about him? Very impressive season last year. Last 337, 381, 448, and 291 plate appearances last year. Really showing his hitting prowess last season. Could be a nice depth player in your lineup that adds that hitting for average that you don't necessarily see that often on the free agent market, especially for hitters. But then other guys out there, Justin Turner, James McCann, Mark Canha, Paul DeYoung, Manuel Margot, Anthony Rizzo, Yasmani Grandal, a lot of interesting talent. Like again, not necessarily the talent was either signed or traded away like the Bregmans and Alonsos of the world and Sotos of the world, but still guys you could add to your roster. And you're always going to have to look for positives if you're a team in contention. And last but not least, I don't necessarily think there will be a big spring training trade. I know that the White Sox are potentially looking to offload Luis Robert Jr., but I don't necessarily know how much he's going to garner in a trade. And the Yankees potentially wanting to move on Marcus Stroman, as they've already added enough pitching depth for this season to where Stroman might not be as needed as people thought he would. But I don't think there's going to be anyone big moving in this free agency cycle. And I feel like there have been a lot of trades, but not one that really has pushed the market, except for that Bregman trade. And ultimately, more or less, players are going to have the ball in their court over the next couple of years. So I really think one of these teams is going to have to offload a player rather than, have teams come to them looking to make trade offers. But let me know what you think in the comments. It's getting pretty hectic in terms of how we're going to be thinking about MLB free agency, especially in certain spring training cycles. But I just wanted to clarify a little bit because coming up next, we're going to transition to the world of the NFL for a little bit, talking about how in this year's draft, teams can start thinking about how they might build like the Eagles offensively. It's going to be an interesting segment right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we're going to be getting into a very interesting segment inspired by an article I read on CBS Sports about how certain teams can view this draft in terms of potentially finding players that could lead to them building like the Philadelphia Eagles. And I know that it might not make sense in hindsight how certain teams can begin to build like the Eagles, but I feel like the Eagles have had a blueprint of certain kinds of players that they're looking for that are in this year's draft, that a lot of teams that feel like they're on the precipice of contention are going to be looking for. So I feel like this segment's going to make a lot more sense as we talk about the players and the comps that you can find in the draft. But overall, it will make a lot more sense once we get to know which teams are going to be in on these players. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with, the basis of the roster. Not just, the offensive line, but the guys they found, whether it be through acquiring their services or in the draft. Let's start off with Saquon. Saquon's one of those guys who's a home run hitter, solid north-south runner, adds a lot of power in the receiving game as well. And I feel like the most obvious comp is going to be Ashton Jeanty. Ashton Jeanty is going to fall somewhere potentially in the top 10, maybe in the middle of the first round, but he's going to go to a team that's really going to appreciate his services. Somewhere like the Cowboys or Broncos are getting talked about for Ashton Jeanty. But the reason why Ashton Jeanty comps so well with Saquon Barkley is because of the fact that both of them have the home run hitting ability in their game. Jeanty might need to improve on his backfield diagnosis. His stance especially needs to gain in terms of getting to the NFL level, but they have that ability to break off 60 to 70 yard runs, win games for you that way, dominate in the run game. And yes, part of it is relying on that line, but if you don't have a running back who has a solid feel for the game itself outside of your offensive line blocking well for them, then what's the point in trying to draft one? So Ashton Jeanty does come with a caveat just because you feel like you need to have a solid offensive line around you, and right now, maybe the Cowboys and Broncos aren't at that level yet. But by acquiring a running back of Jeanty's caliber in the draft, it allows you to set a foundation to where Ashton Jeanty can reach the heights of Saquon Barkley because they have those similarities in their game as instinctual runners able to get you a maximum number of yards. Now let's transition to the hardest part here, the quarterback. And in the Philadelphia Eagles system especially, because there's no way that you can truly find someone like Jalen Hurts where he's competent enough to pass the football when it matters and win in the margins, but control the offense through the run game. And part of it comes from having that ability to run the football yourself and have that dual threat aspect to your game and add that threat to what Saquon or a Saquon comp can potentially do. But in this year's draft, it's hard to find a specific comp. But remember, Jalen Hurts was not a highly coveted player heading into his own draft, much like someone potentially like Jalen Milroe. Jalen Hurts, not the most popular option in the second round of his draft, and Jalen Milroe might be someone who goes higher than people expect and not be popular with the fan base of whoever he goes to just because he's more of a project. But, as always, projects could be fun to develop, especially in a system if you're, say, a team like the Browns or, say, like the Rams who might have QB trouble, to develop a guy like Jalen Milroe on a team that's steadily improving. And part of parcel for finding a guy like Jalen Hurts is that he has to have that accuracy, that ability to win on crucial downs if the run game isn't going. Jalen Milroe has proven that he has the arm strength. He's proven in certain situations that potentially he can deliver the accuracy for you, but it's not necessarily as polished as you would like. So he could be a little bit behind in his development rather than a guy like Jalen Hurts who had that 1 year to sit and then immediately started to grow and mature in the offense. And now at a point where he's willing to allow a guy like Saquon to take over a bigger offensive role. So that's what the caveat is with Milroe, but he is the closest comp, I believe, in this draft to Jalen Hurts in terms of finding a quarterback who could thrive in a system like the Philadelphia Eagles have employed. Now let's get to an interesting position here, because we don't often talk about Dallas Goedert enough in this Philly offense. Dallas Goedert is a truly integral part of this offense because you love A.J. Brown, you love Devontae Smith if you're someone who follows the Eagles. But the reason why Dallas Goedert is so underappreciated because he is someone who is a chain mover specifically. He's at a tight end where he's going to get the headlines like other guys around the league, like potentially Kincaids and Laportas. He is someone who specifically fits into this offense as a security blanket. But he's a tough, physical, inline route runner who's able to exploit the seams, did it very well in the postseason to the point where he was one of the more integral reasons as to why they even advanced the championship game and played a big role in that game as well. And so, while there are certainly more important players in this offense, I believe that developing a tight end like Dallas Goedert who can sneak up on you is very important. There's already one, I believe, who already could be further along than Dallas Goedert in his development, sitting right in the middle of round 1 as well for some aforementioned teams. Tyler Warren, truly special talent, truly elite route runner, truly elite in whatever you really need him to do. And if Sean Payton gets his hands on him, this Broncos team could be well on its way to becoming the next Philadelphia Eagles, the AFC version of it at the very least, because it would finally be a quote-unquote Joker-level player for Sean Payton to develop into his own image, and someone who I feel has a skill set to be even better than a guy like Dallas Goedert, who's seen as more or less a chain mover in this Eagles offense. Tyler Warren could be way more than that if I'm, say, a Cowboys or Broncos picking in the middle of round 1. So whoever gets their hands on Tyler Warren really has a player who has all the makings of what you want in an elite tight end already, and can move around the line of scrimmage to his heart's content and really find the matchups that work for him. And that's the reason why I wanted to highlight that positional comp, because it's not often talked about in terms of how important Goddard is to this offense and how important a guy like Tyler Warren will become for whoever he goes to. But now let's get to the defensive side of things, starting off with the interior. Jalen Carter, a guy who didn't necessarily in the Super Bowl make himself as known, but that's just due to the depth of the Eagles' front seven. But Jalen Carter generates pressure from the interior to allow guys outside of himself to have big games. And Mason Graham out of Michigan, to me, is the closest comp here. Mason Graham, not necessarily elite in terms of generating sacks from the interior, but he is a run stuffer. He eats a lot of space in the interior to allow for edge rushers to get home. And he can really shore up a front seven just with his presence alone. He's a big guy who is versatile in how he's able to attack the middle of an offensive line. But he is a very close comp to Carter just because they can win for you in the interior and really make it difficult in the pocket for opposing quarterbacks. Now, I don't necessarily think Mason Graham's going to come in as polished as Carter was, but Mason Graham can profile as someone who can grow to a role where he is a game changer for a team that can steadily make the postseason. And I actually genuinely think this is a top 10 pick right here with Mason Graham. A guy who can certainly go to a team on the outside of the top 10, potentially like a Panthers or something to shore up their interior. And then last but not least, Quinyon Mitchell, a rangy corner with instinctual ball skills. And the closest comp to me is a guy who we haven't seen too much out of. Siobhan Revell got injured last year, didn't play as much for ECU, and it's going to rely on his measurables to see where he goes in the draft and how he works at the combine as well. But he is someone who has the range, verticality, and coverage ability to grow into someone like Quinyon Mitchell and potentially be an important depth piece in his rookie year as well as what Quinyon Mitchell brought. And so therefore, these 5 players for the Eagles and their 5 draft comps are exemplars of how to potentially build a solid NFL roster. But let me know what you think in the comments about these draft comps for some of the elite Eagles players that got them to where they are now. But coming next, we transition back to the MLB, doing my MLB power rankings. First of their kind on the show, heading into the depths of spring training. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available every...
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we're going to be talking about the MLB yet again, getting into my first ever power rankings for the show as we get into the full swing of spring training. These are the teams that are going to be heavily monitored, not just in spring training, not just at the start of the regular season on opening day, but throughout the entirety of the MLB season, whether they end up being as good as we think they're going to be or underperforming expectations. But without further ado, let's get into the top 5 teams that I feel are deserving of their place in my first power rankings. Starting off at the bottom here with the New York Mets. This is a team of destiny. This is a team of culture. This is a team of identity. And the big question, though, is going to stem from their newest arrival, Juan Soto. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, how he fits in this locker room with positive guys like Lindor, like Alonso, like potentially Iglesias again. How this team coalesces with Juan Soto's personality now within their ranks. But I'm not worried about it right now because we haven't really seen them play live games, because on paper, this team is the most talented roster potentially in the entire MLB at first glance. Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto, Mark Vientos, Pete Alonso at the top of the order. Guys like Brandon Nimmo, Jose Iglesias, Jeff McNeil contributing above average hitting. Potential bounce back year for a guy like Francisco Alvarez, and being able to retain pitchers who you really like and want to continue to build around, and Sean Manaea and Paul Blackburn. Bring in AJ Minter to shore up your bullpen. Bring in a guy like Clay Holmes to add to the back end of your rotation. And this Mets team really now looking every part of not just an NL contender, but a World Series contender, and willing to be the team potentially to challenge Los Angeles Dodgers for NL supremacy. But to no one's surprise, they're not going to be the only team from the NL East within these rankings. They're not going to get this there yet, because we're going to be talking about number 4 team in my rankings. Their crosstown rivals, the New York Yankees, who they quote-unquote stole Juan Soto from. Now, the Yankees, in many different aspects, if you look at how they addressed the loss of Soto, you could say they got better, at least defensively, which to me is more important than retaining a player of Soto's caliber, because it was glaringly clear that they were one of the most terrible defenses in the MLB last year. And it was in spite of that defense that they got to the World Series. But by looking at their moves, by bringing in veteran guys like Goldschmidt in the infield and Bellinger in the outfield respectively, and then signing, finally, to much fans' relief, a left-handed pitcher in Max Fried to bolster their rotation and give it that variance that it so desperately needed, and still being able to have Aaron Judge, a fantastic power bat in this lineup and rely on guys like Anthony Volpe, Austin Wells, and Jazz Chisholm to continue to improve, you're setting a foundation for yourself where, without a generational talent, you still believe your championship window is firmly open if you're the New York Yankees. You don't necessarily have to rely on a Juan Soto caliber player to get the most out of your lineup. And they're starting to appreciate that aspect. And with the additions of Bellinger and Goldschmidt, they could decline offensively, but on the back end of things, and the bright side of things, most importantly, you have two defensive stalwarts that you can rely upon that immediately fill that glaring area of need. And then, of course, Max Fried just allows you to go lefty-righty a couple more times in your rotation schedule. So it's very intriguing now to see this Yankees team moving on from Soto, but still feeling like their window of contention is firmly open, and I believe so too. But it's going to be a tough season if these pieces that they brought in don't necessarily develop the way they want them to. But I'm still giving them the benefit of the doubt ahead of spring training. And then at number 3, the first of the two NL East teams ahead of the Mets in these power rankings, the Atlanta Braves. And this one is just more about the return of Ronald Acuna Jr. Because with the return of Ronald Acuna Jr., it just adds depth to the outfield, makes potentially one of the most dangerous outfields, both offensively and defensively in the league, and just allows this Braves team to feel like the sky's the limit again. Because for all the times Ronald Acuna Jr. has gone down, you feel like their hearts sink to the bottom of their throats, Braves fans, and the Braves themselves, so to speak, because they know he's the heartbeat of this team. And now that he's back, there's going to be a spirit about this team where they know that from 1 to 9 in their batting order and in the infield and outfield when they're playing defense, they know they have a heartbeat, a vocal leader, a identity guy that's going to keep this clubhouse together. Because I truly feel that they're a different team when not just guys like Olsen, Riley, Harris are performing, but when Ronald Acuna Jr. is there to hold it all together. So that's what makes them so dangerous. And yes, they lost Max Fried, but still, Spencer Strider's a top-end guy who a lot of teams would love to have as their number one starter in the rotation. So the Braves are looking much better than they were heading into the offseason. Ronald Acuna Jr. potentially not immediately going to come back, but still, that optimism that he will come back eventually, and potentially with the Braves having a big lead in the NL East to look forward to, Ronald Acuna Jr.'s return can only mean good things for that roster. So the sky's truly the limit if I am the Atlanta Braves. But then again, like I said, they're not the only NL East team besides themselves and the Mets in these rankings, which leads me to my number 2 team here, the Philadelphia Phillies. And now, the thing about the Phillies is that this Phillies team is starting to get the feel of that late 10s, those late aughts, early 10s Phillies teams for that matter. Because in 2008 they won the World Series. They continuously made the playoffs after, but never truly got back to the precipice of winning a championship again. They bring in Bryce Harper on a 13-year deal. Now he's entering the 6th year of that deal. He's hit 152 homers over that stretch, but now it's the back half of that contract. If they don't win something with him now, then I don't know when they will. But this is their best roster. They have speed on the base pass in Trey Turner. They have power bats in Castellanos and Kyle Schwarber. They have elite pitching in Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, and Ranger Suarez. They're going to have to look to retain Ranger, though, after the end of this season, as he could be a hot commodity as well on the free agent market in the coming years. But for now, this Philadelphia Phillies team, to me, represents a team that finally looks like they have the talent and potential to get going in the NL. Because to me, the problem with the Phillies is that they always seem to lose their cool in critical moments. Last year was against the Mets. A couple years ago, potentially the Dodgers, got their number. But I feel like this year, the NL is so wide open, so undefined, to the point where even though the NL East is going to be the toughest division, the Philadelphia Phillies are going to be a team that no one wants to face. Because I feel like they're going to head into the postseason on a high in terms of confidence, rather than, being afraid of what's going to come ahead. That was their problem, in my opinion, a couple of years ago. That was their problem last year against the Mets, because they potentially either get too overconfident or they allow teams to get going in these series to the point where they get themselves out of their heads and out of the series as a whole. So that's why the Phillies are such a complicated team, but in terms of talent, they are the team challenging the Dodgers, in my opinion, in terms of NL supremacy. But until someone knocks off the Dodgers, they will remain the number one team heading into spring training as the number one team in my power rankings. Because look at this team. This is a team that only got better this offseason, and their biggest offseason moves, in my opinion, were not even those high-profile signings of Sasaki and Snell to add depth to the rotation. They were the retaining signings of Kike Hernandez, of Tommy Edman, that really stood out to me. That goes to show that this culture is here to stay for this Dodgers team. It's not going anywhere. And the fact that they feel like they can continue to build on it and are willing to do so to extend this championship window for as long as they possibly can, that's incredible to behold. Because this team just seemingly never says die. And last year was finally the year we saw them break through, battle their demons in terms of actually getting over the hump in a regular World Series tournament-style format. And now this year, they're heading into the season as the best roster on paper, but also in terms of just pure talent. You could have potentially two Dodgers rosters that will be competitive in the NL. That's how deep they are, and that's how deep they'll continue to be, because this is a team that's willing to spend big to continue to win and also have the young talent that they're willing to invest in as well. So, the LA Dodgers, for as long as they can continue to prove on the field that the best team in MLB, will not be knocked from this perch for quite some time. So that concludes my top 5. There are some dark horses that we might want to mention, like the Rangers and Orioles in the AL. Potentially, some teams in the NL as well. The Brewers could be seen as a quote-unquote dark horse. Let me know what you think in the comments below, because coming up next, we transition across the pond to preview a very intriguing top half of the table clash between Aston Villa and Chelsea. Will either of these teams truly contend for the top 6? We'll talk about it right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back in to the final segment of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast for today. And we'll be talking about a top half of the table clash in the Premier League that could determine the legitimacy of both of these respective teams' chances of contending for the top six. Aston Villa taking on Chelsea this weekend in the Premier League. And this is a very interesting game because both of these teams are not necessarily in the best form. Chelsea, 2 losses to Brighton, 1 in the FA Cup, 1 in the league, that see them kind of mired in inconsistency. And Aston Villa not winning a Premier League game since a 1-0 win over Everton just over a month ago. So both of these teams heading into this game not necessarily in the best form, even in cup competition either. And so we're starting to begin to question how these teams profile in the title race, but most importantly, how they profile in the top six race, because actually neither of them are going to contend for the title, in fact, because of their form. And they're really going to have to focus on winning in the Premier League to truly contend in the top six, because right now, in the Champions League at the very least, I don't really think Villa will be competitive, and Chelsea should really be more concerned with developing a consistent starting 11, planning for the summer, rather than worry about the Europa Conference League, which in all reality doesn't mean anything if you win it, in my humble opinion. But without further ado, let's jump right into this game and how I think both of these teams can look at this one. Right now, Aston Villa are slowly falling down the table. They actually have the worst goal differential at -3 of anyone in the top half of the table. So their backs are truly up against it. Chelsea, have been kind of in enough form to where they can still say they're within reach of the top four. But to me, maintaining, say, top six, fifth status will be best for them, because both of these teams, in my opinion, still need a lot more. And it's the moves they made in the January transfer window that I think find themselves in this spot. Last result was not necessarily a result that we can expect to see this weekend, because Chelsea blew Villa out of the water, 3-0. Jackson Fernandez and Palmer were the goal scorers in that one. This one I feel like will be a much more tense affair, because both these teams will be trying hard not to lose, trying hard, to try and get positives out of this game. But in all reality, when you look at these two teams, you look at how they were expected to perform this season compared to where they are now. Villa is very disappointing, whereas compared to the start of the season, a result like their last result against Chelsea would have been embarrassing to them, because they were actually performing well. But a big reason as to why they were performing well was the performances of John Duran, and now they let him walk inexplicably to Saudi. And I know that you feel, if you're Unai Emery, if you're this Aston Villa organization, if you're the players, that you have enough in your front line to compete without John Duran. He was a spark plug for you, man. He was someone who would come in as a substitute no matter what minute, what urgency was required of Aston Villa in the game, and get the job done for them. And so losing that really gives Aston Villa this kind of bad taste in their mouth. Like, they let John Duran go to Saudi, not necessarily for that much money either, and now they're failing to score, at very least in the Premier League, in front of net, resulting in them steadily dropping down the standings to the point where we could say they might not even be in top contention. Whereas Chelsea, to me, they're a team that are weird to figure, just because they are humdrum right now and how they're going about things. I don't necessarily think they're willing to take cup competition seriously, so we would think that they will be taking the Premier League more seriously, but they're barely kind of staying afloat in the Premier League. I'm just going to check their run of form right now to make sure that I'm getting a lot of things right. They did have a win over West Ham a couple weeks ago, but they got blown away by, Brighton twice now, to the point where you feel like this Chelsea team is just watching these younger teams, more willing teams go by them in the standings. But they are more than the sum of their parts. However, the question that's consistently asked of Chelsea is, well, are you going to get legitimate players that can be clinical for you at important times of asking? Because right now, they are becoming a little bit too Palmer-centric in my opinion, and the players who are performing at an elite level to start the season, gaining in confidence, guys like Cucurella, guys like Madueke, guys even like Gusto, guys like Jackson at the top, guys like Fernandes in the midfield, who they invested so much in, has slowly started to decline as well. And so, headed into this matchup, this Chelsea team just needs to look for answers in how they can continue to improve this starting 11, but also start to think of their long-term future. Not to say that they should completely abandon hope of competing for a top 6 or 5 spot, because right now the Premier League holds all the cards in gaining that extra place in cup competitions next season. So right now Chelsea are in a good place. But I just want to see more variety, more passion in this team again, much like the start of last year. Because not since a 3-1 win over Wolves, again, much like Villa over a month ago, did Chelsea look that impressive to me. And so, this game, right now, for both teams, it's going to come down to how they feel they can compete for top positioning. And right now, Villa playing Liverpool today, tied 2-2 in the 65th minute. If they can get a result out of that, they can clearly go into this weekend's matchup feeling like they have the upper hand against a Chelsea team that might not have a solidified roster that they can believe in, a solidified lineup that they can believe in, week out in the Premier League. And Aston Villa could take advantage of that. But Villa, on the other hand, have to weigh their good form in the Champions League with this form in the Premier League. Because if I'm Villa, I would love to stay at the very least on the periphery of the top 6 to have a chance of competing in Europe again next year. But in the Champions League, you've really been impressive if you're Aston Villa. You have a very impressive result against Bayern early on, and you were able to secure a spot in the last 16 by finishing in the top 8 in the table. So, if I'm Villa, will this game against Chelsea really mean more to me than trying to invest in the Champions League, where, shockingly, you stayed afloat? And Unai Emery, I feel, is more willing to invest in cup competitions, especially competitions like the Europa and the Champions League, to further promote this Aston Villa team as a threat and a contender in those competitions. So, even though this game against Liverpool can hold a weight heading into that matchup against Chelsea if they get a good result right now, I also think that if I'm Unai Emery and I'm this Aston Villa organization, I would say in the Premier League, not necessarily to focus on trying to stay pace with the top 6, but also think about how we can compete in the Champions League. Because Villa are a team to me that really could be a contender to usurp some of these big 6 teams. But it's going to heavily depend on their balance. Because right now, their balance is slowly starting to wane. And it's starting to affect how we view them as a European threat in the long-term future. And that loss of Durant really did them no favors either. So if I'm Villa heading into this game, I'm saying we're going to try and get a result as best we can, but let's also consider where we are internationally in competitions. And if I'm Chelsea, I'm thinking of this as, well, we really don't necessarily feel like we should compete in the Europa Conference League. It would be nice to win, and we just want to develop as many players as we can, try and find a concrete starting 11 where we feel like we have the pieces we need, but also heading into the summer can add to these guys as well. So this game may not be as, dominant for Chelsea as it was the last time, but it's going to be a game that could be integral to how these teams view their chances in the Premier League, not just in the short term, but the long term as well. Let me know what you think in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow, same time as always, 2:55 p.m. Eastern. I'm out for today, though. See y'all tomorrow.